and welcome to the Newsfeed. I'm your host, Jackie DeFusco. The Newsfeed is a new EIV show that aims to bridge political division by replacing Facebook fights with face-to-face conversation. We draw topics from reoccurring social media debates and revisit those debates live, bringing together everyday people with passionate opinions to find meaning in Facebook banter. Today's panel will be delving into the ongoing debate over the role of safe spaces in institutions of higher education. A safe space is a place where a group of people can feel confident that they will not be exposed to emotional or physical harm, whether that be in the form of discrimination, criticism, or harassment. In the wake of the presidential election, an increasing number of students are calling for safe spaces, particularly members of historically oppressed groups that feel threatened by Donald Trump's administration. Many schools have responded to this call, creating safe zones on campus and emphasizing the need for trigger warnings before addressing sensitive material in the classroom. Some even provide diversity and inclusion training for students and staff. Supporters of these initiatives argue that security is fundamental to educational advancement. Others argue that this emphasis on comfort is hindering to freedom of speech and intellectual debate. Professors are finding it difficult to foster conversation on controversial topics. Many conservative students have found it easier to remain silent than be deemed offensive by their classmates. Some Trump supporters have suggested that they too need safe spaces. To investigate this issue, we have decided to examine the concept of safe spaces at Emerson College. As a top journalism school, Emerson professors accentuate the value of the marketplace of ideas. This rationale holds that the truth will emerge from the competition of ideas in a free, transparent public discourse. Yet, as the #1 LGBTQ-friendly college in the country, Emerson is also an outward supporter of safe spaces. Since the election, many Emerson students have engaged in Facebook debates regarding safe spaces and freedom of speech. Coming up next, we'll introduce our panel of Emerson community members and begin to examine the nuances in this pressing discussion. And we're back with our panel of Emerson community members. First, we have Emerson College President Lee Pelton and senior journalist in residence Douglas Struck. Then we have Emerson student and Boston Globe intern Samson Amore and Emerson student Eric Picone. First of all, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. First, can you tell us your pronouns, a little bit about your position here at Emerson, and how it pertains to this conversation on free speech and safe spaces?
My name is Lee Pelton. I'm president of Emerson College. I'm in my 6th year as president here. I'm in my 19th year as being a college president. And I'm glad that we're having this very timely conversation. I would like to provide a little historical perspective to remind all of us here and our viewers that this topic is not new. It's at least 50 years old on college campuses, especially with respect to freedom of expression and speech, but also with respect to, I guess, what we're now calling safe spaces. So this is not a new topic, although it's been much debated in the last several months.
My name is Doug Struck, and I'm a senior journalist in residence at Emerson College. I was lucky enough to come to Emerson College after more than 30 years as a journalist, most of it for the Washington Post and Baltimore Sun, a fair chunk of it as a foreign correspondent where I saw places that did not practice free speech. So I teach a variety of courses here from freshman to graduate, including one of the most fun and interesting courses that I teach is ethics in journalism, where we deal with these questions often.
My name is Samson Amore. I am a journalism major here. I'm in my 3rd year at Emerson. I was lucky enough to actually take one of Doug's ethics classes, which was quite fun. My pronouns are he, him, his, and as Jackie mentioned, I'm currently interning at the Boston Globe on a co-op.
My name is Eric Picone. I'm a marketing major with a political communications minor. I'm a libertarian, limited government conservative, and I try to be as active on campus as possible regarding politics, especially with things like safe spaces and freedom of speech. And earlier in this year, I put a petition up online to the Emerson community asking to host a libertarian or conservative speaker to come to the school to engage in a more divisive conversation that I think is important in these times.
Great. So the first Facebook debate we are going to be covering tonight is one following an Artisy article called Living in the Emerson Bubble. The article describes a scenario where one Emerson student was asked over a dining hall conversation if he would ever take an internship at Fox. When he answered yes, he quickly became the subject of what he saw as a verbal attack by other students at the table. According to the article, he was never given a chance to defend his point of view. This became a vehicle for conversation about the liberal Emerson bubble, the writer arguing that hearing other people's sides without expressing disgust is a fundamental social skill. Many people who oppose safe spaces argue that they are sheltering and do not prepare students for the challenges they will face in the real world. With this example in mind, let's see what our panel members think about this point.
Well, just to go off the general topic of safe spaces and what it's like to engage in conversation here at Emerson particularly, I would say he has a point in that you often do get rejected quickly for any opinion you have, and it's often on a basis of more of an ad hominem argument rather than a actual logistical or statistical argument, and I think that doesn't help to foster conversation here, and I think it's a real problem when you get shut down just for having an opinion that isn't necessarily seen as the right one, and I think the idea that we live in a liberal Emerson bubble is something that is definitely true, and I think it points more to the fact that of how much liberalism has truly changed in the last 20 years or so. I mean, being a liberal, a classical liberal in the sense that like the founding fathers were liberals because they believed in freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and that is what
founding fathers also owned slaves. I would like to throw that in the mix.
But liberalism in the classical sense is freedom for all of these things, and that is what made you a liberal 50 years ago. That is why people like Dave Rubin nowadays, for anybody who knows him, he still identifies as a liberal, but he doesn't see himself as part of the left because he doesn't see the left as having liberal ideas anymore. And I think that's part of the thing that we don't talk about enough is that our liberal ideas are something we don't actually hold true anymore in a lot of ways.
Okay. So, this conversation that inspired this article, it was had between a person of color and two queer women. And one of these women commented that she would feel both unsafe and morally compromised working at a place like Fox. And that the writer, as a white and straight passing male, would have the privilege to take that job. So, Samson, I want to ask you, I know that you're more of a print and radio journalist, but theoretically, as a member of the LGBTQ community, would you feel comfortable taking a job at Fox?
Well, it's hard for me to answer this question, mostly because as a journalist, I also like to focus on relevant media, and I am saying this completely honestly, I do not see Fox as relevant or accredited media. So on that basis, I would deny the job. If you're asking me to speculate whether or not I would be comfortable in a particular workplace based on their attitudes towards queer people, I mean, that's really hard to tell. A face value answer would seem like I would want to say no because Fox has said things in the past that have been very discriminatory towards queer people, towards people of color, towards Muslims, etc. So on that surface level, I mean, I guess I would say no. But the thing is, if you're in a position where you have the luxury and the privilege to choose a relevant workplace, your safety should factor into it, but also sometimes it's hard to tell before you go on the job. I think the thing that people would need to pay attention to is if they take a job and they experience something discriminatory, that's when it's time to say, hey, I need to do something about this. Mm-hmm. So that's a very roundabout answer. I can't give you a straight up yes or no. I know I would not like to work for Fox just based on my journalistic ethics. Okay. So, yeah.
So, President Pelton, I'd like to ask you in terms of Emerson as a safe space. I think for a lot of people that go here, as is the #1 LGBTQ friendly school in the country, this is a safe space for this community, I think, in a lot of ways that the real world is not. So with that in mind, I guess in your opinion, what is the value of that security in an educational environment?
Well, that we use that word safe space, I think, in a fairly uninformed way, because it has various meanings in various circumstances and for various people. So, for instance, what informs Title IX is that people who are subject to sexual harassment or sexual misconduct or sexual assault are not safe. And because they're not safe, then they don't have full access to the academic environment. And I think we can say that about some other sort of instances. I think, for instance, students who are not healthy don't have access in that way. So in that sense, the campus is not safe. So, it really depends on how we're using the phrase safe space. I think safe space, when we're talking about in terms of freedom of expression, that's a really very complicated topic that requires a lot of discussion, which we're going to indulge in tonight.
Okay. So, Samson, in an article that you wrote, and you were speaking of safe spaces, you distinguish between comfort and safety. And, one commenter that talked about this article said that in this political climate, particularly, we can't afford to, she said, ally with such soulless companies. So, in your opinion, has the Trump administration changed the conversation from comfort to safety for a lot of members of the LGBTQ community?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's hard to say again because I am like one trans queer man speaking on this issue, so I certainly don't want to put myself up as the bastion for everybody. But what I can say is I have experienced a shift in my own work and in my own everyday feeling of what it's like living under this presidential administration. I mean, we were all very, very privileged to live under Obama. A lot of people don't agree with that, but as a queer person, as a trans person, that was like the utopia when it came to a presidency in terms of what we're looking at now. What we're looking at now is a man who has incited violence in various ways against various people, and we have that concrete evidence that that has happened. And so I think when it comes to, the violence aspect and then the harm aspect of it, that is definitely, unsafe speech. And that has, anybody that would be listening to that has every reason to be worried. Again, though, it is really early into the administration, and as much as I don't necessarily want to defend those actions that I just said were deplorable, we still don't quite know what's happening yet. I mean, he hasn't even hit 100 days. So hopefully things will improve. But I think it's definitely justified if you're a minority in this country. I think you're definitely justified in your fear. And I think it's very unfortunate that you're in that position. But, we've just got to stay strong and keep moving.
I would like to add that I think we have to be very careful when we talk about being afraid or being fearful. While those are obviously personal reactions and we can't stereotype them, nevertheless, the Supreme Court has made a clear distinction between the type of speech that is an expression of free ideas and this type of direct fighting words, is what the Supreme Court said in 1942, that might lead to blows, might lead to violence. And I think we need to maintain that discussion. There is absolutely no defense of any sort of rhetoric that attempts to incite violence. On the other hand, there really is no defense in the Constitution for free ideas and for the free expression of even opinions that seem to be offensive to us. So I think we have to be very careful when we say, well, we're afraid. Well, yes, we're afraid, but are we afraid of violence or are we afraid of ideas that are just uncomfortable to us?
Okay.
And I think to add to that as well, what I would say is like most people from the left side is they're like, they're seeing people who are like putting Pepe memes everywhere, or even trolls who might or may not, because we've seen many faked attempts of writing like swastikas in places. Who knows how many of those are actually real and how many are fake.
How do you distinguish a fake swastika? If you see the symbol, it's there.
Well, I mean, like people who are like trying to cause a stir, who are not actually, who are like actually, like we've seen people who are like actually on the left who have done it to try to frame people on the right. Like those are actual reports. But what I've seen in terms of actual violence has been the riots from the left in the protest of Donald Trump. We've seen it, whether it was Berkeley or just recently at Middlebury College, we see people literally rioting, destroying property, and harming individuals who voted for Trump, whether they know them or not. And I think that's where most of the violence has actually been coming since the election.
Yeah, but if you look at the majority of the protests that we've had in Boston, there hasn't been any single arrest that's been related to anything violent.
Right, and I'm not saying it's directly in Boston, but
I know,
there are
but
clearly events that are happening.
The thing is you have to keep in mind, I'm not saying that if you're a leftist and you're mad that Trump is president, you should go loot a store.
Right.
But what I am saying is that argument is very dangerous, because what it does is it puts a focus on a very small portion of people that might have actually gotten into some sort of legal thing. And the thing is you've got to realize if somebody gets arrested and if there's a protest, there's a lot going on. I've covered protests before. I'm sure Doug has been there. They are hectic. They are oftentimes, even if there's nothing wrong going on, they're often a mess. And so the thing is I would stay away from vague, this thing happened at a college, somebody broke something, because, you need to look at and I would argue this if there were conservative protests happening. You need to look at the entire span of the protests that have happened, and you need to see you need to go fact-based. You need to say, okay, how many of these actually had a violent outbreak? How many of these had arrests? What were these arrests linked to? That's the other thing. If somebody's arrested for being somewhere without a permit, they could just be standing there. That is an arrest, but it's not the same thing as an arrest for burning a car.
Right.
I'm sorry to interrupt you guys, but we're actually out of time for this section. So we're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, our panel will address the role of safe spaces in political conversation. Welcome back to the news feed. We are going to move on to our next article, also written by an Emerson student, called Stop Unfriending Trump Supporters on Facebook. The writer, a self-identified liberal, draws attention to the lack of contact she had with Trump supporters over the course of the election. She calls upon those who see Trump as a threat to stop isolating themselves from those who disagree with them. For many students who felt endangered by the election results, this could be seen as disruptive to safe spaces. So to the panel, my question is, should students be forced to encounter opposing political opinions in college, even if that makes them feel uncomfortable or even unsafe?
Well, I'll start. I'm very uncomfortable with the word forced, obviously, but should they be exposed? Absolutely. I think we do a disservice to our community, to our students, if we try to shield them from the reality, the ugliness of real life, of real opinions, of real discourse. And I think that part of the job of a college should be to try to train, to try to educate people to deal with real life. And that means dealing with opinions that can be hurtful. It means dealing with ideas that can be distasteful. It means dealing with opinions that can be downright obnoxious. But I think that is our role, and I think we ought to encourage that reflection of reality.
So, Eric, I want to ask you, one of the commenters under this article wrote that they have been unfriended by many, particularly Emerson students, over the course of the election due to their conservative beliefs, and often without being asked why they voted the way they did. So just tell us a little bit about your experience at Emerson being right-leaning, and what has that been like in class and in more informal discourse with students in general?
Well, my experience is that I'm not a particular Trump supporter. I am a libertarian. As much as I didn't necessarily like Gary Johnson, that is who I voted for because I couldn't deal with the other two. But my experience has been one of that I've really tried to push boundaries with people, especially as I get closer to people with friends. I try to bring up topics more, and it becomes easier when you get to know people because they see you as a human being and not just somebody with an opposing opinion. But in particular, in classrooms and stuff, my freshman year I took a government and politics course, and I remember I really was quiet that year. I didn't have the confidence yet to say much. Because I had differing opinions, and I feel like it was a difficult way to learn because I couldn't give my opinions, and it's similar like that on Facebook. I don't think I've been unfriended by anybody on Facebook for my opinions, but it's definitely something I can see as being a problem, and one that I think is really self-deprecating to people who actually want to share ideas. I mean, even if you completely disagree with somebody, if you are true to your argument and you think you're right, then presenting an argument to them is the best way to get them to believe something else, not shutting them off. That doesn't change their opinion. That doesn't do anything. If your opinion is actually the right one, like you think it is,
how
then
are we defining a right opinion? Can I ask you?
It's just an opinion. I'm saying if somebody is true to their own opinion.
I'm just intrigued by that. When I hear right, I hear facts, but facts and opinion are often not.
Right. Well, I'm saying if you believe
confused.
your opinions and you have the facts on your side and you present them in a logical way, then that should be the way you shut down opinions that you don't like or things that you don't agree with. I think that's the best way to do it instead of completely shutting them off.
So, President Pelton, I know Eric came to you this year with his petition, which asked, a right-wing speaker to come to Emerson. And, under this particular article, several commenters referred to Trump supporters as racist. sexist, homophobic, and said their reasoning is obviously broken, and that to frame it as something that needs understanding or examination is is kind of an insult. So, when Eric came to you with this petition, was that attitude among students a consideration, and why did you approve that idea despite this?
Well, yeah, Eric did talk. It wasn't a petition. He wanted to bring a conservative libertarian candidate to campus, and I was very supportive of that, and I'm still supportive of that. What I said to Eric was that I don't. The president's office does not provide funding to individual students. We provide funding to organizations, and so if it came back to me as part of an organization, whatever it might be, and if he'd also solicited funds from the SGA, I would also make it happen. By the way, we had the only presidential candidate that we had on campus last year, twice, was a libertarian candidate. So this is a place that is, in fact, open to different points of views. So a couple of things. One is, except for speech that is not constitutionally protected, the whole idea of speech is not to protect easy speech or comfortable speech. It is just the opposite. It is to protect odious speech that makes us, puts us in a place of discomfort. Discomfort is a place where we learn and grow. As William Blake once said, without contraries, there is no progress. And so debate and discussion is a place, an enormous place, an opportunity for intellectual, academic, and personal growth. So obviously, as an institution of higher learning, I very much support these places of discomfort and debate and discussion and doing what we're doing this evening.
Okay, so Samson, one of the people that Eric had suggested come speak, and this was ultimately not the one I think that ended up coming through, was Milo Yiannopoulos. And, obviously he's known for saying pretty controversial things about the transgender community.
He's known for saying controversial things about everybody, least of which the transgender
That's true.
community.
So, with that being said, I'm interested to hear your perspective on how would you feel, in the lens of this as a safe space about somebody like him coming and speaking at Emerson?
Well, I think it would be hard-pressed to get him on campus simply because he is massively irrelevant at this point. Simon & Schuster canceled his book deal. The majority of people are realizing that he's just one of those talking heads that makes a lot of noise. And he seems to be somebody, I don't even know if you could really call him a political figure, but he just, I don't know, he likes to, but anyway, having said that, as much as I think that people can benefit from hearing opposing sides, this guy believes that transgender people, which is someone that you're looking at right now, is mentally ill, and it has no problem saying that they are the scourge of society and they need to be fixed. In that case, that's not an opinion that anyone can learn from. And so based on that merit of, can we learn from this? Is this something constructive? The answer would be no.
Oh, but that's not the definition of why we should have free speech. It's not that we have to agree with part of it or be.
I meant learn from in terms of whatever you learn.
Well,
it doesn't have to be.
We learn sometimes when we realize that when we recognize bigotry or hatred. When bigotry or hatred is in the open, we can then recognize it, and I think that's part of.
Would it be safe for the college to have somebody like that in a room full of other people that he would just target? Is that constructive though?
Well,
I forget which Supreme Court justice said this, but you will know that the best antidote to hateful speech is more speech, and I certainly believe in that. So I think that if we're going to have someone controversial like that coming to campus, that the best way we would organize that would be in a debate setting where there's an opposing point of view and where there could be some discourse from which we could all gain some knowledge. I think they tried to do that at Middlebury, but didn't succeed.
Who did they bring to Middlebury? Was it? Do you know the name of the person that they brought?
Charles Handley?
Hannity?
It was Charles Murray who'd written this book about eugenics and African Americans and so on and so forth, and some people described him as a racist. I've read the book. I'm not sure if he is or not, but anyway. So that's. I think that's how you I think that's how you manage that.
I'd like to ask President Pelton if and I really applaud the defense of free ideas and free speech that you make. How do you square that with calls for a safe space on campus?
Well, again, it's how one defines a safe space. So I've been in this situation before where I invited Colin Powell to my previous institution right after he had gone to the United Nations, and faculty were a lot of faculty were upset, and there was a vote not that he shouldn't come or be disinvited, but it was a vote where the faculty just expressed their disapprobation with him, and that was absolutely fine with me. And there were some protests outside and so on. So I was very grateful for that. I do want to say this because I think that the primaries and the general election and the election of Donald Trump has created a really visceral, emotional, and I'm not saying this in any negative way, reaction in a lot of people. I think part of what we hear is this is a debate between Democrats and Republicans, and it's really not that. There are a group of people in this country who, having heard the president's rhetoric, having watched his behavior, which has been odious in so many respects, that they feel personally hurt and personally and deeply offended that he should be elected. Mm-hmm. And so I think that deep emotional feeling and sentiment, it's more than a feeling, but it's sort of like an attack on my identity, that it was fierce and brutal, and I think that's led to what we've seen recently.
But part of that,
sorry to cut you guys off, but we actually have to move on to our last debate. TV, right? Gotta love it. Our third and final discussion will cover an article written by me, and that is entitled "A Twitter Interview with the Anonymous Alt-Right at My Liberal College." After an alt-right group hung advocacy posters around Emerson College, I conducted an anonymous interview with the group's leader via Twitter direct messenger. I came to find out that the person who hung these posters is in fact an Emerson student, an outlier who feels alienated in our dominantly liberal community. Many conservative students, not just the alt-right, feel alienated by the political climate at Emerson. Yet many students felt frightened by the presence of the alt-right in what they previously assumed to be a safe space. This poses the question, where do we draw the line between free speech and hate speech? Panel?
Well, clearly there's no line drawn like that by the First Amendment, that speech is protected and that the protections we have for people who are brandishing swastikas are the same protections that we have for people brandishing peace signs. And if we lose one, we lose them both.
So let me ask you, as a journalism teacher, a lot of students in particular were really upset about the objective approach that I took to writing to this article, and they argued that there really can't be any objectivity to white supremacy, that to be objective is on the side of the oppressor. And I'm curious to know, what do you think is the role of journalists in this situation?
I think that criticism misunderstands objectivity. One can state objective facts without giving up moral ground. We as journalists objectively or morally agree that murder is bad, but we objectively report that it happens. We morally agree that government ought to be honest, but we objectively report that people lie or politicians are corrupt. I think in the same sense, we can morally agree that the theory of white supremacy is outrageous, but we objectively report that it's there, this is what it is, this is what they say, and lay that out for society to do something about. If you suspect you have an illness and you go to a doctor and the doctor says, well, I want to order some tests, you want those tests to be objective. You don't want them designed by the drug companies that wants to sell you drugs. You don't want them designed by people who are against vaccines because they're against medicine. You want the objective evidence of what's going on and then decide what to do about it. Journalists do the same thing.
So I want to, this is a really interesting topic. First of all, this freedom of expression and speech is culturally determinative. So there are countries other than sort of autocratic countries like China and in Russia, where there's state-controlled press. There are other industrial nations where certain kinds of speech that we allow here are not allowed there. Germany is one, for instance. They curtail speech around Nazism and so on and so forth in a way that we don't. But last summer, Jim Ruttenberg, an editor for the New York Times, posed this really interesting question. He said, if you think that the president-elect is a demagogue, how do you remain objective? And he posed that as a question. And I think it's a legitimate question because to the degree that the press, the Fourth Estate, helps us and inoculates us against, autocratic, dictatorships and so on and so forth. And under those circumstances, the press has a role to play, and it's not just objective. Yeah. And so he asked this question, a legitimate question. He was really asking about the New York Times. Can you be objective when you believe that the president-elect is a demagogue? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask, and I think it's very complicated. The answer is very complicated.
Yeah. So what I'll just have to say about that is that the line between free speech and hate speech is one that should not exist. Hate speech is, in terms of how most people loosely define it nowadays, because it seems like more and more things are considered hate speech, hate speech is most certainly protected. The only thing that's not protected is something that it does incite violence. And in America, we are particularly fond of free speech. In terms of percentage-wise, about 71% of Americans agree that people should be able to say whatever they want. Whereas the
According to which poll?
Pew Research poll, I believe.
Okay,
the global median for that is about 56%. So we're on the upper echelon, and also on the Freedom of Speech Index, we're also number one on the list. So I think as a country, we're pretty good. In colleges, however, and millennials in particular, millennials believe that about 40% of them think we should censor things that are offensive to minorities, or something that would be similar to like what Canada just did with their, you can't say anything bad about like Muslim people or Islam or something like that. And I think those Orwellian speech laws are not the way you contradict opinions you don't like. And I think that is a bad way to go. Losing your freedom of speech in any regard is just, if you don't have all freedom of speech, you don't have any freedom of speech.
Can I just want to counterpoint to this, because there's this notion, which I think is fiction, that somehow the liberal wing of this nation, especially among young people, is that it's viciously opposed to it's attacking these profound principles. But I want to suggest that it's not really the liberal. It's the conservatives. Do you know how many conservative colleges and universities that we have in this country that are religious based, that really govern not only speech on campus, but behavior and ideas and philosophy? You won't find that at a liberal arts college anywhere, but you will find that at a host of religious-based. I mean, go to Liberty University, for instance, and you talk to me about the freedom of speech there and the freedom of various ideas. They don't exist. So I think we need to balance out this notion that somehow liberals are wrecking, American principles of free speech. I don't think it's true.
It's true, and
I'm sorry, guys. Unfortunately, we are out of time for tonight's episode. Be sure to tune into our next show airing on April 24th. Until then, let's keep the conversation rolling on Facebook. I'm Jackie DeFusco, and this is the Newsfeed.